It's helpful to bring a Haggadah Shel Pesach just so you can follow with us. Not necessary because it's a book that we tend to be familiar with more or less. But next time it's okay to bring a Haggadah that you have from home. This is the second part of the series that began in the fall on Haggadah Shel Pesach. In the first session, we really covered a lot of material, beginning with the 12th chapter and the beginning of the 13th chapter of Exodus, which is the proto-Seder, what begins the yearly observance of Pesach. It is a really important chapter because it's also the first laws. It sets the Jewish calendar. So we covered all of that. And then really got to the point in the Haggadah where we're ready to tell the story, because all we've been talking about so far in the Haggadah is how we tell the story. Everything that we've covered before, right? How long it has to be, different opinions about how long it has to be, about how to tell the story. Today, we're going to start with how we tell, or the actual story itself and what it looks like as told in the Haggadah, which is rather surprising. But before we get there, I just want to repeat what I submitted several times in the first part of the series. And that is my assertion that Pesach is the central holiday of Judaism. That if you want to encapsulate what Judaism is and how it approaches the world, just learn about Pesach and you'll pretty much understand it. The natural state of the world is a world that is full of oppression and tyranny. That is how the Bible tells this story. It begins, and in fact, the Mishnah insists, you begin with the natural state of the world. Slavery. Ganut is what the Mishnah calls it. Ganut is indignity. This is going to be an interesting part of the class because we have a war going on now in Europe. Something like I've never seen in my lifetime. And it's a reminder to me, and I think to all of us, that perhaps what we've come to call normal, that is, countries trading with each other and acting peacefully with each other, more or less, and respecting each other's territorial sovereignty, more or less, what we've come to call normal is actually abnormal. That the normal state of affairs in the world is exactly what we are seeing take place in Ukraine. The mighty overtaking or seeking to overtake the weak. That is the normal state of the world. Even if it hasn't been the normal in our lifetimes, it doesn't take much knowledge of history to understand that that is the way most of history operated. The mighty took advantage of the weak. It's true on a national level, mighty countries and weak countries, and it's also true on an individual level. Mighty people taking advantage of weak people. That is the steady state of the world. That is the Ganut that the Mishnah insists we begin with when we tell the Passover story. You begin with the natural state of the world, which is indignity, which is the powerful taking advantage of the weak. And you learn the story of Pesach in order to confront that, in order to produce a tension within you that says this is not the way it ought to be. This is not the way it needs to be. We can overcome this. There can be redemption. That is Pesach. That is Judaism, confronting what over centuries and centuries mankind has come to accept as the normal way of things, with a wild attitude that the world can be better, that you can overcome oppression, that there can be justice, that we can overcome poverty, that you can overcome oppression, even sickness. You can even overcome sickness. You can even overcome death. It's all at Pesach, right? It's a little hint of, what is Eliyahu Hanavi doing at the Seder? He is the symbol of redemption, because the ultimate redemption in Judaism is the revival of the dead. So obviously there's a place, obviously there's a moment in the Seder where we honor that. Nothing natural does a Jew take for granted. We can overcome the natural. That's tikkun olam. That's redemption. That's Pesach. So on one level, this is a story. The Pesach story is a story of history. It's something that happened to a specific people at a specific time. But if that's all it is for the people around your table, you're missing the point. If you're telling this story as history, you've missed it. Because this isn't just the story of one people at one time. It is a paradigm. Slavery, oppression, the state of our ancestors in Egypt is an exaggerated version of the reality endured by most people, right? It may not look exactly like a taskmaster whipping you while you're building a pyramid. It's an exaggerated version. But most people, most of the time, find themselves beholden to powers that they don't wish to be beholden to. It is the reality that most people endure for political reasons, for economic reasons, for societal reasons. And our answer is no. All human beings are meant to be free. All human beings are meant to be free. Not a long time ago, the Jewish people were enslaved to Pharaoh and God freed us with a mighty hand. We take that for granted. At our Seders, it's, and all people are meant to be free. And what a Seder we're going to have this year, right? To talk about the reality of a world in which people who are powerful can so easily take advantage of the weak, right? And the Jewish position is stand with the free. If you didn't know it before, I'm surprised if you didn't know it before, right? But if you were wondering whose side we're on, right? This is why we're on the side of the Ukrainian people. It's because our story is always to side with the weak against the oppressor. The most devastating effect of slavery, the most devastating effect, and we see it in the Haggadah, but I've talked about it before over the years, and certainly you've read it elsewhere. What is the most devastating effect of slavery? That over time, the slave comes to internalize her status. Over time, what becomes unnatural, over time, what was unnatural becomes natural. Over time, you just accept, hey, this is the way the world works. That is the most devastating effect of slavery. And if you're wondering why Judaism insists that we, first of all, tell the story of the redemption from Egypt every year, even if you know it already perfectly, but that's just the beginning. We have to recall, according to Jewish law, the Exodus from Egypt daily, right? In the morning and in the evening with the Shema. Why do we keep recalling? Why does every Jewish ritual, almost every Jewish ritual, it feels like, it's not true, but why do so many Jewish rituals appeal to the Exodus from Egypt? It's all because of an awareness that we can so easily succumb to unnatural, oppressive circumstances so easily because we can internalize it. We remind ourselves over and over again, nope, this isn't the way it's supposed to be. It's not the way it's supposed to be. It's not the way it's supposed to be. You don't give in. That is the essence of this ritual. Why do we do it every year? Why does it say, Afilu kulanu chachamim, kulanu nevonim, kulanu yodim et Torah, even if we were all wise and smart and intelligent and know the Torah by heart? Why? Because knowledge is not sufficient. Very knowledgeable people can fall into the trap of indifference. It's not knowledge. It is resistance. It is a reminder, an insistence that you are not meant to be oppressed, that freedom is the ideal, that there is a redemption that Judaism imagines. There is a world that Judaism imagines, and it is our job to bring it closer to reality and never to give up on that goal. Never to accept the world as it is, but always to remind ourselves that there's a different existence that we need to be reaching for. That's Pesach. That's why it's an annual ritual. That's why it's so central. That's why we remind ourselves of the Exodus from Egypt over and over and over again. And that's what brings us to where we are in the Haggadah now, which is Midrash Arami Oved Avi. Before we get there, just so those of you who have your Haggadot, it's been a few months. So if you want to know where to find Midrash Arami Oved Avi, it starts with Se Ulmad. It's right after V'hi She'amda, which is where we left off last time. V'hi She'amda, remember, is another one of these passages in the Haggadah, which reminds us exactly what I was saying, that this is not a historical study. That's not what we're meant to do at the Seder. This isn't just about one time where someone rose up against us. This is about those who rise up against us in every generation. How the story becomes relevant and new, and how it becomes central in our own lives, if only we take a chance to think about it and envision it and remember it. So right after V'hi She'amda is Arami Oved Avi. But before we get in there, let me just remind you, because as I said, it's been a few months. So let's just remind ourselves of one of the central disagreements in the Talmud about how we ought to tell the story. Remember, the Mishnah says, as I mentioned earlier, the story must begin with degradation and indignity, gnut, and end in praise, end in shevach, which is thanksgiving or praise. That's how you tell the story. But the Mishnah doesn't offer any specifics. It just says start with degradation, end with redemption. And excuse me, not redemption, end with thanksgiving. So where is degradation? So remember the disagreement between Rav and Shmuel, the famous disagreement between Rav and Shmuel on how you tell the story. For Shmuel, redemption is political, meaning it's living under oppression and moving towards freedom. So where does the story begin? For him, it begins in Egypt, right? It's the experience of living in exile. That's his definition of indignity. But for Rav, redemption is not political, it's spiritual. For Rav, the story has to begin earlier. Spiritual redemption culminates when? If I asked you, when does Judaism's spiritual redemption culminate? The answer is Sinai. So since Sinai, the receiving of the Torah, that is our redemption. When does our indignity begin? It doesn't begin in Egypt, right? Nothing spiritual really happened in Egypt. It begins earlier. It begins for Rav in idolatry. Before Abraham, in other words. Tell the story of the Jewish people before they became a people. God brought them closer, eventually culminating in the giving of the Torah. But originally, right, Abraham came from somewhere. So that's Rav and Shmuel and their difference of opinion in how the story is told. Keep in mind, though, that the two are related. Let me repeat that again. The two opinions, Rav and Shmuel, are related. That indignity, the definition of indignity for one is exile. For another, it's idolatry. But exile, and particularly slavery in exile, is related to idolatry, isn't it? That is, it is only when the Torah tells us that every person has equal dignity. It is only when the Torah tells us that every person is created in God's image. It's only when the Torah tells us that every person has infinite worth, right? It's only when we get to that point when we realize slavery must be offensive to God. So do you understand what I'm saying? Rav and Shmuel have different opinions as to where the degradation begins. For one, it's political. For one, it's spiritual. But the two feed, the one feeds the other. Someone who is idolatrous, who worships the physical, who accepts the world as it is, sees another one's poverty and accepts it as the way it is meant to be, and sees her own strength and accepts that as the way it ought to be. And why not manipulate? Why not take advantage? The two go together. But a spiritual redemption culminates in slaveries, in a redemption from slavery as well. The two are very, very related, even though they take a different position as to how we tell the story in fact. Right? But I think we are, again, you know, what's going on in the world, what's going on in Eastern Europe informs us as to how, as to the story the Haggadah is trying to tell. What is idolatry? Idolatry is the worship of a human system as perfect. Idolatry is the worship of a human image, but a human image can be anything. You know, we think of idolatry as a pesel, as a rock that is carved into some image, because that's what we've seen, you know, in museums and stuff. But that's not where idolatry ends. That's the beginning of idolatry. But idolatry can also be the beginning of the worship of some system, man-made system, as an image of perfection. Like, for instance, a national system, like communism, like totalitarianism. The worship of that kind of system as being, oh, that is God's image. That is what is perfect. That's what leads to oppression. And anyone who deviates from what the system says, right? Anyone who deviates from the system says is immediately, their dignity is denied. Their life has no value. And that's what tends to happen in these totalitarian systems, which, you know, occupied most of the 20th century in terms of what mankind was busy grappling with, and we thought we had overcome it. But whatever in Putin's head is the system that he devises, right? His notion that the land that I say is mine is mine. The people that I say is mine, and there's no exceptions to the rule. And the people have no value. The people are illegitimate. It's the land that belongs to us, right? That totalitarian system is idolatrous. It's saying of land that a land is black and white, mine, right? The people have no value. No wonder the fight for land, even though it begins initially as, no, we're interested in the land, we're not going to harm any civilians. I mean, how quickly did that evaporate? Because when you're worshiping a system, then human dignity has no value. No wonder children are being bombed. No wonder. So Rav and Shmuel have a lot to teach us in their disagreement about the relationship between what we believe and what we experience. Political oppression leads to idolatry. Idolatry leads to political oppression. Many people say that what is the symbol of the Pesach sacrifice? Why a lamb? Daniel, why a lamb? You learned this? Why do we sacrifice a lamb at Pesach? Why not a bull or something?
Wasn't the Egyptian god?
That's right. The lamb was an Egyptian god. Some say, the Torah doesn't say it, but some historians will tell you that the lamb was a symbol of an Egyptian deity. So when God said to the Jewish people on the 10th day of the month of Nisan, you will take that lamb. It's coming up, that's Shabbat Haggadah, right? You will take that lamb and then you will sacrifice it on the 14th. It was saying, you first defeat idolatry. You first produce a message against the idolatry, and then your freedom will come. When you defeat when you can show the weakness of the ideology, the political freedom will come. Isn't that what happened in the Soviet Union originally, right? When communism was shown to be a failure, then the Soviet Union just broke up, right? When the Jews took the lamb and showed the failure of idolatry, then Pharaoh could let them go. Seeing the superiority, not seeing their human rights, but seeing where he failed, seeing where his system failed him. His hopes failed him. He had been vanquished spiritually. So a political admission of failure came easily, came naturally. So we're going to use all of this information to understand Midrash Arami Oved, and helps us understand why the Haggadah chooses to tell the story of the Exodus of Egypt with these verses. If I was going to ask the average person who knew more or less the Torah, at least generally, that we were told, in the Torah to sit down and discuss the Exodus from Egypt, and we need a base text. Give us a text that we can use in order to expound on the Exodus from Egypt. What text would you have chosen? Probably the one we studied in the first few weeks of the class. You'd say, oh, you want to learn about the Exodus from Egypt? Read the 12th chapter of Exodus. If not that, read some other parts of the story. Read earlier on, the 10 plagues. Read the whole book of Exodus. The first part, maybe, before the redemption. Wouldn't you think that would be the appropriate base text? And yet it is fascinating and crucial, I think, that the Haggadah chooses a different text to tell the story. The text that is chosen is taken from the book of Deuteronomy, not Exodus. It is called Arami Oved, Avi. It is the central text of the Haggadah, right? Everything we've been learning up until now has led to this moment. This is the peak of the Seder, the highlight of the Seder. It's 4 verses. It's the longest section of the Haggadah, so we're going to spend some time on it. But more important than that, it is the central portion of the Haggadah. And yet the one I think many families skip over. So I hope in the next few weeks to give you an appreciation for this text. So you won't skip it over because there's no songs here. So in many Seders, we skip over to the songs. This is the part where children lose attention, but this is the whole Haggadah. It's right here. It's Arami, oved. The Haggadah chooses these 4 verses in Deuteronomy in order to tell the story of the Exodus. Let's just open up our Tanakhs. I'll open mine up for you so you don't have to get your own. Just so you have some general familiarity with these verses and you can see I'm not making it up. I'm reading from Deuteronomy 26, chapter 26. I'll just start from the beginning. When you enter the land that the Lord your God is giving you as a heritage, and you possess it and settle in it, you shall take some of every first fruit of the soil, which you harvest from the land that the Lord your God is giving you, put it in a basket, and go to the place where the Lord your God will choose to establish his name. Does this sound familiar to anybody? What does this sound like? What ritual is this? Do you know the name for it? The first fruits. What do you know what holiday is associated with this? Not Sukkot.
Shavuot.
Shavuot, right? You'll go to the temple with a basket of the first fruits. This is called the Bikurim ceremony. That's why another name for Shavuot is Chag HaBikurim, the festival of first fruits. Okay, the text here does not give a date. It doesn't say you do this on the 5th day of Sivan. That's a whole other story of why there's no date given in the Torah for Shavuot. And actually the Mishnah says you could do this. It's not just done on one date. There's a whole time of the year where you can perform the first fruit ceremony. But the important thing is the introduction of this ceremony into the Israelite consciousness when you enter the land. So that gives us a sense of where we are in the telling of the story. This is Moses speaking, and he says, soon you will be in the land, and I'm giving you a commandment that you will have to fulfill when you're in the land, right? Which already should strike you as odd. I thought we were here learning about Pesach. Why are we talking about Shavuot? I thought we're talking about the Exodus from Egypt. I thought we should be in the desert somewhere. Why are we in Israel? I thought we're talking about slaves. Why are we talking about farmers? So let's, very good. So you'll get, yeah.
Does it have, when you think of the first fruits, you have to think of the plague with the first children?
Interesting. There's a connection there. First fruits to first children, right? We'll get there. First, I just want to introduce this text to you. So you have a familiarity now with where we are in the Torah. You shall go to the priest in charge at that time and say to him, I acknowledge this day before the Lord your God that I've entered the land that the Lord swore to our fathers to assign us. So in other words, you go to the priest and you say, basically you present your ID card, right? Just telling you I'm Jewish, I'm here in the land, I reside in the land, and I'm doing my duty. The priest shall take the basket from your hand and set it down in front of the altar of the Lord your God. So the priest takes it from you, puts it in front of the altar. This is at the temple. You shall then recite as follows before the Lord your God. You recite something. Now, the Bible is not big on prayer. There's not a lot of prayer in the Bible. There's actually very few places where it says you have to say something. You, Jew, have to say something. There's a lot of you have to listen, you have to observe, but there's not a lot of you have to say. This is one of the unique sections of the Bible which command that you as a Jew must say something once a year when you bring your first fruits at the temple. This is what you say. Arami, oved, aviv, hayered mitzrayma, vayagor sham b'mtei me'at, v'hisham legoy gadol atzum varav. Sound familiar? My father was a fugitive Aramean. He went down to Egypt with meager numbers and sojourned there, but there he became a great and very populous nation. The Egyptians dealt harshly with us and oppressed us. They imposed heavy burdens upon us. We cried to the Lord, the God of our fathers, and the Lord heard our plea and saw our plight, our misery, and our oppression. The Lord freed us from Egypt by a mighty hand, by an outstretched arm and awesome power, and by signs and portents. He brought us to this place and gave us this land, a land flowing with milk and honey. Wherefore I now bring the first fruits of the soil, which you, O Lord, have given me. There is an affirmation, let's call it, that every Jew must make when he or she brings first fruits to the temple at the Bikurim ceremony. I just read what that affirmation is. These are the verses that the Torah uses, that the Haggadah uses to tell the story of Egypt. Not the book of Exodus, but these verses. Why? Why choose this? Why choose these 5 verses and nothing else? The Torah has plenty of verses that we could have chosen to tell the story of the Exodus from Egypt. So here are a few opinions. Theory number 1, I'm going to give you 5 theories. The 5th one is going to be the one I prefer. Theory number 1, familiarity. Familiarity. Since these verses were said at the temple on a regular basis by many people, it's the equivalent of in our day, Borei Pri Hagafen, or some words that are used in Jewish ritual that many, many Jews are familiar with. And if you're sitting around a table and want to have a discussion, best to use some verses and words that people are familiar with instead of some verses and words that people are seeing for the first time. That's explanation number 1, familiarity. They're used on a regular basis by many people. They tell the story of the Exodus from Egypt concisely, so why not? Right? And that's the second explanation for why these verses were chosen, not just because they're familiar, but number 2, because they're short. It's only 4 or 5 verses. That's it. And imagine if the Haggadah included the entire book of Exodus, or even several chapters. Remember, what is the goal of Midrash? When we talked about Midrash, I introduced you to it a few months ago, or some of you already know what Midrash is, but I reintroduced many of you to it. What does Midrash do? Midrash will sometimes take a letter and write a whole exposition on the place of one letter in the Torah, and certainly will do so with one word, right? So if the idea at the Passover Seder is to delve into the text, which is what Midrash does, it digs into it. Well, it's going to be a long night if I give you 3 chapters to read, right? So that's a second probable reason for why these verses were introduced. Not just familiarity, but they're concise. They tell the story in a reasonably short way. Number three, sorry. A third possible reason. This was suggested by a scholar named Israel Yuval, who I met him a few times, but he's obsessed with the Passover Seder. He was at the Hebrew University, Israel Yuval. And he believes that we don't give enough credit to the authors of the Haggadah for their understanding of what the corresponding Easter rituals were in the churches. He says that many of the rituals in the text chosen in the Haggadah were a response to the Easter rituals in the churches. Remember, the relationship between Easter and Passover is closer than the relationship between any Jewish holiday to any other Christian holiday. They are strikingly similar, but take very different interpretations on what the sacrifice was that led to liberation, redemption, and also what liberation and redemption looks like. For Christians, their redemption that they received is personal. It's salvation. What did God give us on Passover? God gave us his son, and that redeemed us personally. For Jews, they reject that entirely and say there is no personal salvation. There is only global redemption. There's only the salvation of this world, not in some other world. And that day hasn't come yet. And so we work towards it. And the Exodus was not some culmination. It's just the beginning. It's the initial event that produces that tension to remind us to reject the world as it is and seek something better. For Christians, it's the culmination. Easter is Christianity. So he contends, I know you had a question, Merle. He contends that the reason the rabbis chose this text and not Exodus is because the Christians were using Exodus for their sermons. And he cites tremendous amounts of historical evidence that indeed suggests that most of the sermons being offered at Easter in the Christian world were delivered on, not surprisingly, like Lamb of God, right? Not surprisingly, were delivered on the books of Exodus. So this text doesn't make reference to any lamb. It is clearly about the superiority of God, that God freed us with a mighty arm. In other words, there was no intervening power or authority. And in his opinion, that's why we chose this text and not Exodus. Merle?
When you say Israel Yuval,
Yeah.
the Haggadah was written over many centuries.
It was expounded upon at different times. This is a very early Midrash, though, and it's not older than 2,000 years old. So we know that Christians were delivering Easter sermons in the 6th, 7th century, which is when the Haggadah really becomes a text. It really becomes a package, right? The liturgy of the Haggadah really develops. Does that help answer your question?
So he's alluding to that period of time or to a later.
No, he's alluding to that period of time. Absolutely. He says when this Midrash is introduced, it is a response, right? When the Haggadah becomes a fixed text, and these are some texts, and it doesn't happen all in one day. It happens over the course of time. But when Midrash Arami oved avi, when this text becomes central, according to him, it's because the Jews know that in the churches, they're talking about the book of Exodus, and they want to distinguish themselves from that by focusing on a different text. Okay, that's possible explanation number 3. Possible explanation number 4. If you read this text carefully, Arami oved avi, it is all about a theme that we've been talking about since the beginning of these lectures. What is the theme? Home and homelessness. Even before the ritual begins, what do you say to the priest? I have entered this land that the Lord swore to our father to assign us. Even before you say these verses, you introduce yourself to the Kohen and you say, this is my home. God promised this home to me. You then begin the passage with, my father was a fugitive Aramean. It begins with homelessness. He went down to Egypt with meager numbers and sojourned there. To sojourn, what does that mean to sojourn? Sojourn, he didn't settle there. Right, and the Haggadah makes this clear. We're going to get there. What is a sojourn? Sojourn means he was wandering, traveling there, not to permanently reside. But there he became a great and very populous nation. The Egyptians dealt harshly with us, etc., etc. But at the end, he brought us to this place and gave us this land, a land flowing with milk and honey. It's not just that the text is concise, not just that it's familiar, but it also includes the primary theme, or one of the primary themes, at least give me that, of the Haggadah. And if we're supposed to tell the story and begin with subjugation and indignity and end the story with shevach, gratitude, appreciation, what a beautiful text to have. What is this ceremony? What does it sound like? It sounds like you are giving these fruits to God in order to say, thank you for giving us a home. Isn't that what this sounds like? Why are you giving your first fruits? To say thank you. To remind yourself that everything you have is a gift, to remind yourself that the land of Israel is a blessing and shouldn't be taken for granted. And it's not all yours, that you have responsibility to share it. So these themes fit very, very well into the story, I think, that the Haggadah is trying to tell. Remember, we talked about sharing, what it means to share a meal around the table. That's what this is. It's sharing the good that you have with the priests, with the people, and with God. And doing so in a spirit of thanksgiving. And it begins with the theme of homelessness. How does our Haggadah begin? One of the first passages. This is the bread of affliction. This is the bread of galut, the bread of exile. That we ate when we didn't have a home. This is what we ate. And how does it end? L'shana haba b'Yerushalayim. There's a journey of homelessness to home, spoken of in these verses, I think very similarly. Okay, now I give you the fifth interpretation, and that's my favorite, right? Why not read the book of Exodus? Why read these verses, which are from a different time, in a different place? So when I began this lecture, I told you that the Haggadah must not be looked at as the history of a particular people at a particular time. There is a tremendous danger in reading the book of Exodus. And by the way, there are some Haggadahs that I've seen, new Haggadahs, that do draw on the texts from Exodus, that do tell the story the way the Bible tells the story. And I understand why they're doing it. They're doing it because nowadays we're dealing with many Jews who don't understand even the story of the Exodus, right? They don't even understand it. So we have to tell the story all over again. It's not like they've been going to shul and know the story and are familiar with the story, but think of the danger of that. The danger of getting together at the Seder and telling the story the way it is written in the Torah creates a history lesson. And is that the goal of a Seder? Is that the idea? That we should sit together and read what happened all those years ago? I think it's brilliant that the Haggadah chooses this text, Arami, oved, precisely because it is showing that years after the Exodus happened, it remains a crucial element of Jewish life, Jewish observance, Jewish identity, a crucial element of what that means. In the life of some poor farmer in the land of Israel, it is still animating for him. This farmer, who is just an imaginary figure when Moses is talking about him, right? Moses is saying, one day you're going to come to the land, one day you're going to be blessed, and one day you're going to have to do this. And when you give those first fruits, you're going to have to affirm the centrality of the Exodus of Egypt in your experience of homeness in the land of Israel. That if God had not freed you from oppression, you would not be at home. That seems to me much more relevant and in the same spirit as what the Haggadah is trying to do than had it chosen to give us the verses from the book of Exodus, and we would have been sitting around and telling an old story about something that happened a long time ago. It's not that that's not good. It's nice to read the story and be familiar with the facts of it. But if that's all you're doing, you have not fulfilled the mission of the Seder. The Seder says, look at the world you live in and see that our story of from oppression to freedom still must speak to you today, still must animate your lives today, still must become a core of your Jewish identity, be at the core of your Jewish identity today. Because the redemption of the world did not end, obviously, when we were redeemed from Egypt. There's more work to be done. So look at the world around you. What has to be done? That's the brilliance of Arami oved. Instead of choosing the text that happened at that time, we go forward a couple of centuries and choose a text that relates to a different time when the Exodus is history. And we say, look at how it was relevant in the life of a poor farmer. Look at how that story remained relevant. How is it relevant for me? How is it relevant for us? That's my favorite, and hopefully the real reason why, I don't know, but hopefully the real reason for why the Haggadah chooses Arami oved and not, and a new king arose over Egypt, and which would have been what you expected. But then this would have been a history lesson, and that's not what the Seder's about. Okay? This is what I wrote in my notes. The Seder is not about history. It is about looking back retroactively in order to produce a tension today. A tension that asks, how should I approach the current circumstances in my life, in my world, because of the Exodus? Which text does that more effectively? Arami oved avi or Vayakom melech hadash al Mitzrayim, a new king arose over Egypt? To me, Arami oved avi by a mile, produces that tension. because it takes the life of a farmer whose life is good, who's enjoying blessings, who's living in a land of milk and honey, and shakes him up. Don't you forget, none of the blessings you have can be taken for granted. Shakes him up, certainly should shake us up as well. And what themes does it introduce through the farmer that it never would have introduced had we just learned the text of Exodus? The theme of home and homelessness, which is really important. Look at Ukraine again, home and homelessness. What does it mean to lack home? To be exiled? That's all through the farmer, who remembers that he once was a refugee. That's introduced. Gratitude, tithes, giving from what you have. This is all through Arami oved. And being happy. Did you miss that part? I missed it. He brought us to this place and gave us this land, a land flowing with milk and honey. Wherefore I now bring the first fruits of the soil to which of the soil of which you, O Lord, have given me. See that the land you have is filled with milk and honey. That's the theme of gratitude. You shall leave it before the Lord your God, and you shall enjoy. V'samachta bechol hatov asher natan lecha Hashem Elokecha. This is all in the 26th chapter. V'samachta bechol hatov. Be happy with all the good that you have. None of this you would have gotten from Exodus. But with Arami oved, it is that journey to find happiness and satisfaction with your blessings. That's far more effective, in my opinion, than just looking at history. Okay, now let's get started. Okay, so open up Say Ulmad. Say Ulmad means what? Say Ulmad means let's go and learn. It's two verbs that appear very frequently to get your attention when a Midrash is being introduced. So this section about Lavan Arami is meant to be an introduction to Arami oved. The next page, the next verse introduces, now let's talk about Arami oved avi. But before we get there, the Haggadah gets our attention and says, Tse ulmad, now we will come and learn. I would translate it. But what will we come and learn? Instead of the text saying, now let's come and learn, the story of the Bikurim ceremony, let's come and learn about the first fruits, about what was said at that ceremony. Instead, it says, Ma bikesh Lavan ha'arami la'asot liYaakov Avinu. Where does it get this? Where is Lavan? Who is Lavan? How is Laban coming into this? Remember who Lavan is in the Torah? Who's Lavan?
Rebecca's,
Yeah, but also, you had it right.
it's Rebecca's brother.
No, Lavan. I'm sorry. Lavan is correct. Lavan is Rebecca's brother. Is that what you said? Okay, correct. And remember, Jacob escapes to Lavan's household. And when he's running away from his brother after he steals the blessing.
And he's also Abraham's nephew.
That's right. And Lavan is depicted how in the Bible? Not very favorably, right? He is a bit of a trickster. Lavan is often called in rabbinic literature Arami, the Aramite or the Aramean. And in fact, here in the text itself, he's referred to as Lavan Arami, Lavan the Aramite. So this text is doing something very surprising. If we go to Arami oved avi, how did I translate that? I was reading straight from the Jewish Publication Society Biblical Translation. Arami oved avi vayered Mitzrayim. What does Arami oved avi mean? Merle, you have your Haggadah? How is it translated? Arami oved avi in your Haggadah. A wandering Aramean was my father. Very similar to my biblical translation. I said, a fugitive Aramean was my father. Who is that? Who is the fugitive Aramean who's my father, in your opinion? We don't say the name. It could be Abraham, who was running away. Where was he running away from? There were a couple of points in his life where he was running away, but running away from home, maybe you could say, what's that? Lech Lecha, exactly. He was going forward, wandering around. It could also be Jacob. He was also wandering. Most of the Midrashim say that that's who the wandering Aramean was. Your translation, Merle, is that Midrash that says my father was a wandering Aramean, takes the point of view that the person who gives the tithes is referencing Abraham or Jacob, but one of the patriarchs who was homeless and on the run.
The word wandering and the word fugitive.
Yes, they are different. Right. It all depends on what we mean by oved, which is a complicated word in Hebrew, and it leads to this even bigger disagreement in the text of what does it mean to be oved? Is it a passive verb or is it a transitive word? And does it mean wandering or does it mean fugitive? It could mean both, but because we don't know who the text is talking about, it just says, this is the formula. When you get to the temple and you give your first fruits, you say, Arami oved avi, my father was a Arami oved avi. It doesn't say what that means, who that refers to. But the Haggadah does not think that Arami oved avi is Abraham or Jacob. Who does the Haggadah think the Arami is? Lavan. It's a totally different translation of the text. It uses the verb, for you advanced students, it uses the transitive version of the verb, not the passive version of the verb, in order to understand it. And therefore sees that verse, Arami oved avi, not as reading my father was a wandering Aramean, but Arami oved, from the word le'abed. What does le'abed in Hebrew means? To lose something. Halach le'ibud, you say in Hebrew. It has gone missing. It has evaporated. So Arami oved avi is translated in the Haggadah as an Aramite or an Aramean tried to destroy or tried to make my ancestor, Avi, disappear. Do you see the difference in the translation? This is an important part of the Haggadah that nobody understands. We think the first fruit ceremony, Arami oved avi, my father was a wandering Aramean. That's what my Haggadah says. That is not how the Haggadah translates that. That is not how this text is introducing Arami oved avi. It is a different translation. Not my father was a wandering Aramean, but an Aramean tried to destroy my father. Arami, oved, tried to make disappear avi, my father. And it makes it clear in this Midrash. Ma bikesh Lavan ha'arami la'asot liYaakov avinu. So who is the avi? Avi is, the Midrash says clearly here, it's Jacob. What did he try to do to Jacob? Obviously, it's Jacob, given the Aramean and patriarch. Well, we only know one such pair. Parolo gazal al hascharim. Pharaoh did not decree on the males, only on the males, or I have to get this right. Pharaoh condemned only the males to death. Lavan bikesh la'akor et hakol. But Lavan tried to la'akor, to get rid, to uproot everything. Lavan was worse than Pharaoh. So that's the statement the Haggadah makes before it introduces Arami oved avi. It says, we're going to learn some texts now. And this text begins with an assertion that is even worse than Pharaoh. Remember, the Haggadah must begin with degradation and indignity. So the worst degradation and indignity that is found in the Haggadah is not Pharaoh. It's Lavan. He's the worst. Many interesting rabbinic sermons are given on this question. Why is Lavan worse than Pharaoh? We know, those of you who know the story, I hope you know the story of Lavan. I mean, was he so bad? He didn't enslave anybody. I mean, maybe he enslaved Jacob. Okay, fine. But Jacob could have left if he didn't want to get married, right? It's a different kind of slavery. So why was Lavan worse than Pharaoh? Why is that affirmation being made? Even before we get to the verse Arami oved avi. So I have 4 explanations to offer, and you decide which one you like the most. By the way, this flows very nicely from V'hi she'amda, which is what precedes it, the text that precedes it. V'hi she'amda is, in every generation, someone's out to get us. Look, even before Pharaoh, there were people trying to get us. Lavan was the first. Why was he worse? Explanation number 1. If you look at the book of Genesis, chapter 31, verse 29, Lavan is speaking to Jacob. And says this. Remember, Jacob is trying to escape with his daughters in this chapter. Lavan overtook Jacob, and Jacob had pitched his tent on the height, and Laban with his kinsmen encamped in the hill of the country of Gilead. And Laban said to Jacob, "What did you mean by keeping me in the dark and carrying off my daughters like captives of the sword? Why did you flee in secrecy and mislead me and not tell me? I would have sent you off with festive music, with timbrel and lyre." Remember, God tells Jacob, flee. Laban's upset. Why are you running away? I would have made a farewell party for you before you left. Not nice. You're running. I didn't get to say goodbye to my daughters. You did not even let me kiss my sons and daughters goodbye. It was a foolish thing for you to do. Here's what it says in verse 29. Yesh le'el yadi la'asot imachem ra. I have in my power to do you harm. But it then says, but God told me not to. Some think that verse is the key to understanding why Lavan is worse than Jacob. At that time, there's only one Jew, just Jacob. And when the text says Lavan almost tried to destroy everything, it means Lavan was at that point saying, if God hadn't told me to hold back, I would kill you for you trying to flee with my daughters and my grandchildren. Right? So perhaps that's the reason why Lavan was worse. There's only one Jew, endangered resource, endangered species, and Lavan tried to do his harm. Possible. Number 2. I like this one. Lavan is seen in Jewish theology as the source of baseless hatred and jealousy. Why is Lavan the one who injected jealousy into the Jewish family? Well, because of the jealousy that existed between Rachel and Leah. His whole scheme, right, to marry off Leah before Rachel created tremendous jealousy, not only between them, but more importantly, between their children. All because of this trick that Lavan played. And sometimes the internal assaults, the internal disputes between Jews are more dangerous than the external assaults, than the outside attacks. Do you know what I mean? And that may be what we're getting at here. Why was Lavan worse than Pharaoh? Well, Pharaoh just wanted some slaves. He wanted to physically abuse the Jewish people. But Lavan wanted to harm them deeper. He didn't want to physically abuse them. He wanted to inject a jealousy, a hatred into the Jewish family. And that's worse. Right? Because if you cannot, if jealousy is so powerful and we're so vulnerable to it, that overwhelming a family or a people with jealousy is worse than using them for oppressive labor. Yes, Marcy.
Also, the part of the story where he's really not rewarded Joseph properly for all his years of service as the shepherd. And
Yep.
Joseph sets up, not Joseph, Jacob. Jacob sets up the system where he's going to take the spotted inferior sheep, but they outnumber the others.
Yes.
And Lavan's sons are very jealous and very upset with all of this.
Right.
So his character runs.
And that's where I think this text is so powerful, right? It opens up, all of the Haggadah contains 1 million discussions. And this is an important one, particularly today where there is so much hatred between Jews and competition between Jews. What this might be saying is, and I think it probably is, Pharaoh represents physical destruction. And that's how the story of the Exodus manifests. That's how the story of the slavery in Egypt manifests. But Lavan represents spiritual destruction. Through all of these instances between his sons, between his daughters, between his grandchildren, that is the root of a deeper kind of corrosion that is spiritual, not physical, and it is worse. It's worse because Pharaoh just wanted the males, but Lavan was fair and democratic and egalitarian when it came to injecting his jealousy.
It's also an example of Jews being successful. Joseph-
So that relates to a third possibility for why Lavan was worse. Lavan took advantage of Jacob. You know, I gave a sermon about this, I think, when we ran across this parsha. I think it's parsha is this. It's Vayeshev? No, it's not Vayeshev. It's before Vayeshev. It'll come to me. When Jacob is on the run, he has a dream. You know the famous dream, the angels going up and down the ladder. Very holy dream. But there's another dream that Jacob has right before God tells him to get the heck out of Lavan's house. The dream is of sheep, spotted sheep and other kind of sheep. And many commentators say that this is Jacob manifesting the materialism that was so manifest in Lavan's household. Lavan was all about acquiring and didn't care how you acquired. Whatever he could do, whatever he could manipulate, that's what led to his riches and his successes. That's what Lavan represents. And Jacob living in his house for years and years and years, it would have been a miracle if he was able to withstand all of that cultural materialism surrounding him. And perhaps when he starts dreaming of sheep, it's like a sign that that materialistic culture finally got him, or was just on the verge of him becoming obsessed with it. And that's when God says, get out. So how was Lavan worse than Pharaoh? You've seen three reasonable possibilities. First of all, what did we say? Lavan had the power to kill Jacob. He was our enemy. He wanted him dead, right? It says it in the verse. I have the power to do you harm, but I won't because God told me to be nice. Number one. Number two, Lavan injects, this is the explanation that I use in my Seder, because I think it's very relevant today. Lavan injects jealousy and spiritual decay into the Jewish people, and that's worse than slavery, through his games and manipulations. And number three, Lavan is an idolater. He is materialistic. And maybe that's the spiritual corrosion that almost infects Jacob, and that too would have destroyed Jewish continuity.
Which is emphasized in the first story about them, when the servant comes to get Rebecca. Firstly, they're in a nervous setting,
Yes.
which is something that was always an issue. And secondly, he takes over the negotiations. His father's barely heard of, and he's so impressed by the bling that they give, the gold and whatever.
That's right. That's right. All the gifts and everything. So we know who Lavan is. We know what he valued and what he did not value. And I think even though the Haggadah sees the text Arami, oved differently than we do, or listen, you see that Arami, oved can mean two different things, but the Haggadah chooses to one particular explanation to make this point, which I think is extremely important, right? That before it comes to Pharaoh, it's again, before we talk about physical abuse of people, let's talk about the ideology behind it. Let's talk about the values that lead to that. And that's Lavan. He ruined everything, or he tried to ruin everything. Bikesh Lavan la'akor et hakol. He injected an ideology of hatred and jealousy and dispute. He tried to destroy your family. And when you begin there, that's how slavery, that's literally how the slavery began for our ancestors. It's the story of Joseph. We wouldn't have ended down in Egypt if it wasn't for hatred between the brothers. That's Lavan. So it makes perfect sense to begin telling the story by saying, don't forget, this all begins with an ideology of jealousy, of competition, of taking advantage of the weak. And that makes slavery, that leads to slavery. And we'll start with Arami, Oved, next class. Thank you, everyone.